Welcome, everybody. It is Business Monday in the Money Hour with Gary Sasse, the Money Man. Cha-ching! It's been an all-money weekend, right? President's been off at the G7 talking about money. Friday, the market kind of collapsed a little bit. Money. It's all money with you.
Well, if you got the money, I got the time. You remember that goes, yeah.
A couple quick updates. Kind of bad news afternoon. Two things. One, Rhode Island got ranked 49th for hardest working Americans of all the states analyzed. Not exactly good news, but to some degree, is that a wonderfully big surprise if you're ranked 50th in business rankings?
Yeah, it is, because I haven't studied the rankings, but I take all those Wallet Hub rankings with a grain of salt. I'm much more concerned about performance than rankings, and so my way of finding out the quality of the workforce is to go talk to employers and find out what kind of production they're getting from their workforce, where there are needs that can't be fulfilled. But there is one thing that's very clear about workforce productivity in the state. Our labor force participation rate is down compared to Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Our demographics are horrible. We're not growing people in the 25 to 65 age group, and we're getting older. And so as you get older, you would expect the quality of workforce to be impacted by that. The challenge has always been, and it continues to be, demographics destiny. And with all the work that we've done on economic development, there are two overriding issues that we don't seem to want to address. One is a growth strategy. There's a big difference between an economic development strategy and a growth strategy. And a growth strategy, involves the state working with the cities and towns and communities on everything from zoning. And we've never had a policy that has tried to, this is very hard, I say it glibly, it's not easy, to deal with demographic transformation. And those are the critical issues. So you get all kind of studies and all kind of rankings. I'm not sure what they mean. When I start hearing from employers that they're having qualities with their workforce, then I get concerned. I'm hearing just the opposite. I'm hearing that we don't have enough workers for the jobs that we need.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I don't know, we've had 400 businesses
Yeah.
on GoLocal Live. They all say the same thing, unequivocally. Cannot get enough people. Can't get enough people. Can't get enough good people. But, you look at some of them. I was looking at Lifespan's head of recruitment had a posting on LinkedIn the other day. We're hiring. So I just clicked through to see how many vacancies. Dozens and dozens and dozens of vacancies there. Dozens of vacancies at Hasbro. Dozens of vacancies at IGT.
And yet this is on a much, much smaller scale, but the Hasbro Institute we're hiring, and we had for one position, 22 applicants. And of those 22 applicants, I felt very comfortable with 6. We'll make a decision, but that was a good number. So I don't know what the survey was based upon. I think it varies from business to business, industry to industry. But there's no question that we're not growing enough organically, people who are in the working age population. There's no question that our labor participation rate is down compared to other places. We're not growing as quickly as in other places. And that's the problem you got to focus on. You got to understand why and then think about what you can do to help move it along.
I will say this, when you walk out of here at 5:15 in the afternoon, there's not a lot of activities in the so-called financial district of Providence in comparison to that same time period at an hour or two later in Boston.
No, and you wrote about that. The focus of what downtowns are, is shifting. Downtown is moving towards, the river. The nature of financial service business has changed. Think about this for a minute. 20 years ago, we had 3 big banks downtown.
Absolutely.
That were locally owned independent banks. Hospital Trust, we had Fleet, and Citizens, built that tower probably 25 years ago. Citizens now is a very different bank than it was. It's moved out to the suburbs. One bank has been merged with the other bank, and one is owned by a mega bank located in Charlotte, North Carolina. So if that was the foundation or the tenants downtown that brought things together, and they've moved, less lawyers, less accountants,
Right.
less account clerks. The other thing that's happened too, and gets back to the growth strategy I mentioned. A lot of the financial service jobs that were back office jobs used to be, this is a while ago, but used to be located downtown. You could walk through the Superman building, or you could walk through the Hospital Trust building, and you'd find offices after offices of what now is considered back office operations downtown. And so those people would go out for lunch, or they'd go out and shop, and there were stores. Those back off, the way we do business now has changed. It was too expensive to maintain those back office operations downtown, so they're gone. So that doesn't mean those jobs are gone. It's mean they've been relocated somewhere else. Though
East
there are
Providence or Cranston or
Lincoln, Smithfield. That doesn't mean a lot of those jobs are gone, but a lot have also been relocated to the suburbs.
over the course of your career, you've been an advisor to mayors and city councils in Providence. It seems like right now the city's having some success at some levels. Beautiful new pedestrian bridge in Wexford, and these sort of edifice-driven advancements. There's some energy emerging in technology, but on the flip side, the core kind of functional municipal government, good schools, good roads, good public safety, seems to be under a lot of stress. Obviously we've talked about the schools, and that's in full beginning steps of being reformed. This weekend was a very violent weekend. It wasn't a hot weekend. There was no natural progression of it. The week before, there were 2 different attacks with youths on the hijacked jump bikes, one by the new pedestrian bridge, one up on Federal Hill. There just seems a little lack of sense of safety in the city. Your thoughts?
No, I think you're right. I think in those areas where the city is making progress, those have either been partnerships with the state, or they've been state directed and state involved. So
Those actually have all been state-driven projects, not municipally driven.
well,
projects.
and the municipality gave up a lot to the state when they gave up their sovereignty on some
Right.
of these projects. So the growth you see has been state-driven, or certainly state-impacted, state partnerships. The fundamentals of what a city exists for, is really to make life better for the people that live in the cities. The schools are terrible. In law enforcement, I haven't looked at the most recent FBI crime statistics, so I can't tell you in a kind of scientific way what our crime situation is. I could certainly tell you from a perception viewpoint, it's terrible.
Yeah.
And from a perception, viewpoint, that becomes the reality. It's back to what Mayor Giuliani did when he was mayor. He said, if I fixed the broken windows and took care of the small stuff, things would get better. Well, we seem to be slipping on that. And as you begin to examine the reasons, the common wisdom, don't know if it's true or not, is that we're understaffed, underorganized in terms of our public safety, people. So that's a problem. There's a perception, there's these incidents that are creating a perception that may be true in the reality, or it may become the reality. On crime, the schools are not in, the schools, here we go again.
I'm just reading the screen. It says President Trump. I believe it
I don't
says
think,
President Trump.
no, but President Trump's not I'm not on his call list anymore. And so so you have, those, issues that the city's not, dealing with, schools, public safety. And if you think about it, if you look at the municipal budget and then what they spend their money on, they spend 25% on public safety and another 50 or 60% on schools. So 4/5 of the budget of the 2 functions that we're doing poorly at.
Right.
And that gets back to, one issue, and that issue is leadership. And leadership doesn't necessarily solve the problems, because we can talk about the adequacy of funding and the state really not being a good financial partner to the city, which is no one's fault in the city per se, but it's making the case. It's speaking out when things go wrong. It's taking the leadership in proposing solutions to problems. And so you don't see a dynamic, vibrant, leadership that's trying to stay out ahead of the curve, and so you begin to see what that in other
Listen, you
countries.
heard very little after the two, I think the New York phrase back in the day was wilding incidents where groups of young folks get together and cause extreme, assault people and damage in a community. And then this weekend, listen, you could take all of these incidents this weekend and say, well, that happens regularly in a city this size. It seems to be at a pace that's just different. And certainly one of them was a domestic issue, but you also start to look at, there was a no contact order on the domestic. Do we simply just not have enough police? The staffing right now is around 435. It's up on the commissioner's board. It should be 494. I think the highest it's been in the last 20, 30 years has been around 505. So you could argue we're 70 under, coupled with, we're asking more and more of law enforcement.
Okay,
we're asking a lot more these days.
So I accept, I do believe instinctively that we are understaffed in terms of public safety for police. But then put that in the context. No one in Providence is volunteering to pay more taxes to
No,
support
absolutely not.
more policemen. They already feel their tax burden is high, and particularly with the reval, some communities feel it's unreasonably high. It's been an unreasonable increase. There's a question about the fire service. I look at
One of the only cities in the country that has more firefighters than police officers.
Right. I look at some of the contract and some of the minimum manning requirement. So the city has an obligation to use its resources effectively because it has scarce resources. The resources are finite, and you really deal with what are the needs. Do we need more policemen right now? Can we change minimum manning? Can we deal with less fire people? And there's not leadership. There's not discussion about that. I don't pretend to sit here and pontificate and have an answer. But it's obvious that you have to find more resources, and there are two ways you find it. One, cash, you get more money, and second, you do better with what you have. And I don't think we have that kind of leadership right now. We're not putting our money in the right place. Certainly with schools that didn't, our per pupil spending is very high, and yet the results were pretty awful. The same with public safety, as I just mentioned.
Well, and can you really be surprised if you go decade after decade of undereducating a significant population in the city? Wouldn't crime be an outcome of it? Folks aren't really built to be able to compete for jobs. It's not that right now, as we've talked about earlier, folks are looking for trained employees, and we're producing people who are not trained to become employees.
Well, but part of the other social pathology of crime is that we're a city.
Right.
And so we attract people who may not live in the city. They may live around the city. They may live in Massachusetts, and you need public safety to deal with that. So it's clear that there's questions about how we're allocating money, whether we're putting it in the right place, and that is a function of leadership. There's not a function of waving a magic wand. That is clearly a function of leadership. So we've fallen down in public safety, we've fallen down in education, which is well documented. That's 80% of what we do, and that becomes a leadership crisis when that happens.
Is there a role for the state? I mean, listen, the state's already come in and taken over the school system.
What does that mean? No, seriously, what does it mean?
I don't know. Is it time for the state to open up a barracks of the state police to augment listen, no one police department wants the interference of another police department. That's has been well known since time began. But at what point maybe certain areas get taken over by the Rhode Island State Police?
Or maybe you have to look at the areas as the important question. From an economy of scale issue, you can't have the state police come in and do patrol. It doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Can the state police be of more assistance in investigations and things of that nature? I don't know what they do and what their relationships are, but it also could be the case that we need to talk about metropolitan police and public safety functions, where it's not a question of the state police, but it's a question of North Providence and Providence and Johnson and parts of Cranston,
right.
getting together and creating not a metropolitan government, but a metropolitan police function. If you travel to London, they got metropolitan police that service London and some of the communities around. So yeah, we can sit around and speculate about, these kinds of things. None of them are going to happen until you start electing public officials that will have the resources to have the serious conversation. The other thing that we lack in this state, this affects Providence, it's not Providence's fault. The state does not have an urban growth strategy, period. And the cities compete with the suburbs, as they should, because you can't tell a company where to go. You just want the company to come here. But you can have a strategy to market this place better, to provide the kind of infrastructure you need to be competitive with the suburbs. And so we have no urban strategy. I have felt for a long time that the most important state aid program, the school aid formula, doesn't recognize effectively what it takes to educate, some of the kids that have the pathologies that urban kids have, whether it's language or other kinds of disadvantage. Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of public policy issues that we could deal with. About 2012, at the height of the depth of the Great Recession, the legislature came up with a program called Moving the Needle.
Right.
Needle ain't moved.
No.
Hadn't moved very far.
No.
And the reason, and it's not because of lack of trying, but the reason it hasn't moved very far, the focus hasn't been on urban strategy. The focus hasn't been on how you direct resources to where the greatest problems are. And so yeah, that's something that you would expect the leadership in the city to be pushing for and to be talking about, to be doing their own studies, to use that to lobby the legislature, the governor, to use it to create a public atmosphere with the media. That we have a plan to fix the city. Can't do it by ourselves. Need state help. Need an urban growth policy. We don't have an urban growth policy. I haven't heard once, and maybe I miss it because I don't come down here that often. But anybody in City Hall saying, we need an urban growth policy. And the urban growth policy is not selling the water supply, the reservoir.
No, listen, there's been no economic development plan in this city in 15 years.
And I'm talking about, see, I make the distinction, because I think when we talk about economic development, it becomes a little bit, it's fine, but it becomes narrower. I'm talking about a growth strategy for the city, which includes economic development, but it includes other things that are...
Well, if we don't have an economic development, we certainly don't have an urban growth strategy.
Well, but the growth strategy, economic development is part of it. Economic development strategy won't work unless you do some of the things that you mentioned, that people feel...
How important is Superman building, not only from bringing a workforce down here, but also from a perception standpoint?
Well, I think it's more interesting from a perception standpoint than from an economic standpoint. I was told, because my position's always been kind of mid-18th century, just blow it up. We don't need it anymore. But I'm told that you can't blow it up because there's no place to put the sand and the brick that you'd end up blowing it up. So but the fact that it's been vacant for 10, is it 10 years now? Is it
It's 6 going on 7.
the fact that it's been vacant for 7 years, it's a symbol. And there was a sermon that ministers to our church every once in a while, the myths that sustain us. And so, this is a perception that is not sustaining us, and it's an issue, but it's a tough issue to deal with, and that's...
Is it really that tough an issue to deal with?
Yes, it is.
Why is it so difficult? Why isn't it that with the amount of money we've spent on economic development over the last, I'm just going to go 6 years, the 6-year period, between rebuild and this and tax credits and historic and that of the, I'm going to guess, between all of those around $300 or $400 million, that some sizable amount couldn't have gone to create an environment in which businesses in Rhode Island would consider relocating there?
Well, in defense of the people making the decision and underwriting how we use our tax subsidies, and I've disagreed with how we've done now. Too many residential buildings, too many hotels.
And I'm not advocating for residential.
No,
I think that's a mistake.
But what has to happen is there has to be a market, and that's the state could help, but no one has clearly identified what the marketable use of that property is.
So let me go to the Foundry Complex. That complex, 13 different buildings owned by the Guerra family since, I think, 1968 or 69. They almost lost it in bankruptcies 3 or 4 times. The state went in, saved them. I think in much part the place was deserted in the majority of it, and put Department of Environmental Management in there, helped them finance the first building. That is now, that complex has 2 major apartment complexes. It's, I think, nearly full or completely full. It's got Class A office space. It's got beautiful design. It's a city within a city.
Yeah, but you can't compare just the footprint of what the Foundry looks like, because it has aspects of being a campus.
Yep.
It happens to be in
I
the
think
city.
you can make it to argue that it's even more difficult.
Well,
It's on the greater fringe of the city. There's nothing else over there.
Well,
Surrounded by a pretty tough neighborhood, Smith Hill.
yeah, but I think they had, more, options and alternatives to work with
I think
because
they had more leadership. I think Tony Thomas and the Guerras
no.
were able to push that, and this owner, who's out of state, doesn't have to see it every day, made his money between the lease and the court case
right.
against Bank of America. What does he care?
Well, back during the Chafee administration, and correct me if my memory is wrong, there was a proposal, I don't know how serious it was, floated around to move a bunch of state agencies in there.
Yep, that's at least to solidify it,
Yeah.
and then put businesses around it.
Now, why, and I would guess, I don't know the answer, but I would guess that part of the reason that they decided not to put state agencies in there, was the cost of retrofitting the building, and also the cost of developing the infrastructure around the building to sustain it. Where these people park, just a whole kind of basic, logistical issues. Also, it would have taken, people out of other properties to come to this property. That's a question of choice. It's a question of a growth strategy, an urban strategy. If we had
You and your urban growth strategy.
Well, I lived with Jimmy Carter back in 1970s. That's where it started, actually. HUD was going to do great things, never has. But
He's a great former president. Let's go across the pond. Let's talk about Donald Trump had an interesting weekend at the G7. He seems to have not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, but now 5 different policies on trade with China.
Yeah.
4 new ones unveiled this weekend.
well, as a coach, said if you don't have one, if you have 2 quarterbacks, you don't have one. That is true. No, there was, the Wall Street Journal headline said it all this morning, and and this country, I can't remember it being this poorly represented in international relations, certainly in the last 100 years. But the headline in the Wall Street Journal on the front page above the fold, basically said, U.S. left isolated in G7 summit. Quote. That's a
Right.
quote. So if a pro-business, Republican newspaper, leads to that, then you have to look at why and what's wrong with our president. He clashed with world leaders on a whole host of foreign policy issues. The U.S. position, frankly, was largely ignored. It was ignored in the way the agenda of the French put the agenda together. When the Iranian foreign minister came, it was a surprise. Not going to be a surprise. A country, like ours, which was the leader of the free world, shouldn't be surprised when an Iranian foreign minister is invited to come to.
Was that a cheap shot, though? Was that an intentional cheap shot by the French?
I don't know, because Macron had lunch with Trump the day before, and insinuated those things. And one of the issues that's pulling the partnership apart is the whole question of how to deal, with Iran and to de-escalate.
But let's just talk about Iran and the French relationship with Iran. France was the impetus, was the fuel, pardon the pun, to their nuclear program, and that's well documented.
Oh, there was.
And Iran would not even remotely be in a nuclear threat if it weren't for technology transfer, sometimes legally and sometimes illegally by the French government.
That is true, but just put it in recent historical perspective. Obama negotiates a bad deal.
Right.
Okay. 5 years later, you're halfway through the deal and you blow it up. You blow it up with no option. You blow it up and you create tensions. Not just France, but Germany and
But let me add that the president would argue, whether you agree it or not, is that the only way the Iranians, you're going to see regime change, and he has not been subtle about the call for, is to restore capitalism in Iran and create a market-driven economy, and to squeeze them and cut off other financial options is the only way you're going to see.
Well, this president has not had one success in foreign policy, and it's okay to posture and bully and bluster, but you have to have something behind the bully and the bluster.
Getting out of Syria was probably a positive step.
Well, what we did, it's in Syria because of the situation we had gotten ourselves in, which wasn't the fault of this administration, it was the fault of the Obama administration, because he let the Russians, we had kept the Russians out of the Middle East for 70 years, and Obama just let them back in.
Let them in.
Yeah, so
Don't cross this line. Oops.
Trump, the point was, but where's our leadership right now? So Trump inherits a bad hand in several areas. Whoever was succeeded Obama was going to develop a bad hand. But then you look upon the United States to be the leader in getting that hand improved. The way we've handled ourselves in Iran, pulling out of that treaty, and then further escalating the sanctions causes harm to our allies. It's also not that dissimilar from the trade policy, which are causing global economic issues. So you have a president taking action without understanding that there are consequences to the action. There are consequences to words. You can't say on one day that the guy I appointed to head the Fed is a bigger enemy than the prime minister, the premier of China. That's not exactly the case. And so what has happened at the conference, he clashes with them. He clashes with them on Iran. He clashes with the Brits, which didn't have as good a meeting as he thought, on questions of climate change, which the Brits are very concerned about. He clashes with them on inviting Putin and Russia back into making the Big Seven to the Big Eight.
Back to 8.
Yeah, and it says Obama got upset and he did it. No, it's not true. Putin took the Crimea. Putin started problems in the Ukraine. There are a lot of reasons to boot his butt, out of the G8. It doesn't help to have the President of the United States do this publicly. He may have felt that, and there are a lot of good reasons to feel that way, that Russia's an important country and should be part of the G8. That's a given. But there are ways you go about it. You don't isolate yourself. You don't become a...
Okay, so let's look at the alternative. Joe Biden is now solidifying his leadership position in the Democratic primary.
Not quite.
Except for he ran into a little trouble this weekend. He thought he was in Vermont. Now, first and foremost, the difference between Vermont and New Hampshire from a postcard standpoint might be easily mixed up. From a political standpoint, other than Calvin Coolidge, no presidential candidate has ever gone to Vermont. It was only because Calvin Coolidge was from Vermont that someone visited. He's in New Hampshire, which is where you're supposed to be, New Hampshire and Iowa, running for president, and he says he's in Vermont. Should Americans be very, very worried about this constant blunderism by Joe Biden?
The gas by Joe Biden, he did it when he was 40 years old as well, and nothing new.
I know, but now he's 76 years old, and America's watching.
Well, Americans are going to have to make a judgment as to whether he's up to the job or not. Yes, and so the argument that we keep on hearing is, well, the Democrats have they got a crappy field. They got a 76-year-old guy that hasn't got the energy. The two other closest candidates, one is an avowed socialist, and one has a plan for everything. That
right.
You got to beware of people with 5-year plans. That's what you said about Joseph Stalin. I
thought it was Chairman Mao.
Well, Joseph too. He had remember the farmers in Ukraine back earlier, and so that's not exactly an all-star lineup. But you look around. This is my own personal opinion. You look around at a president that bullies people, that blusters, that doesn't always tell the truth, that gets this country isolated. And you need to make a distinction between what kind of harm a president can do in domestic versus foreign policy. I think his domestic issues, can be fixed, or if a Democrat came in, their issues, could be fixed in short order. There are still checks and balances. There's still a rule of law. I think the blunders you make in foreign policy are much harder to fix. They're much more serious. They're potentially more dangerous.
In a media today, though, that's so driven by little public errors, is this just cumulative Joe Bidenism almost now on a daily basis of misstatements that reinforce that he looks old,
Well,
straight out old?
Well, yeah, don't get me defending Democrats here, but you go to the middle of Iowa, and you sit down, with a working family, a farm family, and see how much they're talking about Joe Biden's, errors. And I would say this, and this is I think is a disparity in this whole conversation. Joe Biden makes these errors, and let's say, just for the sake of this conversation, he makes one a week, he makes two a week. Okay, this president makes 10 a day, and it's become so.
But isn't it managing expectations? Listen,
yes, it is.
But Donald Trump is known as Donald Trump. It's the perceptions of him by the American public now after.
Yeah, but the point.
Let me just
Sure.
complete the thought. The hope is, by many, that Joe Biden is going to be a contrast to him and a dynamic leader that's going to give people confidence about the next 4 years. We're not going to have president by Twitter. We're going to have firm hand leadership. Maybe I don't like him on this, or I'm a moderate and I'll suck it up and vote for him even though he's a Democrat kind of situation. But these constant blunders make me wonder, is he capable?
Wow.
Is he ready to serve?
I can't. I won't answer that question. I would say, when you talk about his constant blunders, talk about Trump's constant lies, and so we become. Our expectations are this. Which is very popular. I don't know what's going on.
This one, that was Joe Biden
Yeah, that was Joe.
with talking points.
Yeah, I got my talking
He's
points.
calling from Vermont.
Democrats very rarely call me these days. But the point being, yeah, they're not a perfect candidate. He makes gaps. We have a president right now that, and I think the referendum has to be on whether Donald Trump is suited to lead this country. I think that should be what the election's about, and people will decide, who not only makes gaps, but is unpredictable, says one thing one day, the next thing the next day. Great example was this thing about China. I don't know, are we trading with them? Are we negotiating them? First we're going to knock the crap out of him by increasing tariffs when he gets PO'd because they did something. And he speaks up at the conference in France, the G7 conference, and says, well, I reconsider everything. Well, you're the leader of the free world. Words matter. I'm much more concerned about that than Joe Biden, having a gaffe about something. And I think you have to, when you think of Trump and
the expectations for Donald Trump, though, listen, Americans voted for him after the Billy Bush video came out. That's the reality. If you think that most Americans are impacted by his gaffes, cruelty, inappropriateness, it does not seem to matter for a significant portion.
Let's put that in perspective. The latest poll, which is a good one, I think it was Monmouth, and had his approval rating at 36%.
36%. And his chance of winning re-election is right now at?
I don't know, less than...
It's about 40%.
Okay, so...
Okay, and the New York Times had his chance of winning election 2.5 years ago at 15%. So he's doing better than he was according to that polling modeling.
Yeah, and his win was the perfect storm. There were 70,000 votes in 3 states that would flip this entire election. But that's not the point. The point being, and this is what I would think about between the way this guy conducts himself and has conducted the office of the presidency, where a number of the secretaries of people in sensitive positions are still acting because they can't get them through Congress, is will Joe Biden organize a better administration? And not that I would agree with it, because I'm center-right, he's center-left. Would he organize a more workable, better, more efficient administration with adults than this guy? I think that's something the American people, you have to think about.
I don't think the American people will think about that for 1 second. American people are going to decide about the persona like they have in every other election since the beginning of time for president.
American people are going to feel what they've been through the last 4 years, and really, and this is where I think Bernie and Elizabeth Warren make their mistakes, and a lot of the Democrats coming out with these very ambitious programs. American people want to get back to a normal government. They don't want to, pick up the paper every Monday morning and find out that 4 or 5 crises that we've created. They want.
But I think that's my very point.
They want normalcy.
That's why Joe Biden is should be of concern to Democrats. The guy doesn't know what state he's in. If it just happened once, I'm all for you. But this is a
I'm not for
regular
Biden.
basis.
Well, you're saying I'm for Biden. I'm very much opposed to Trump. I think it's obvious in this conversation. But I'm not defending Democratic candidates. If you ask me, which candidate I was more comfortable in organizing administration, turning down the drama. We don't need any more drama. We don't need, certainly totally self-centered, presidency. Would that be Biden or?
Last word question. Illinois former legislator, radio talk show host has jumped into the race in the Republican primary. Will we see more Republicans announce that they are running, viable Republicans
Yes.
announce that they are running for President of the United States?
Yeah, I think so.
And do you want to share any of those
Well,
names?
I don't know who
Will one of them be the former governor of Ohio?
Not sure about that, but Jeff Flake might jump into it. People are talking about it now, and it's really a problem. This is true of any incumbent president. They control that party lock, stock, and barrel. And so, if any of these people get in, they have to understand what their mission is. They are not. Trump is going to be the nominee of the Republican Party, but can you create enough critical mass where you force the party to question it?
With Biden over here and Trump over here, we heard murmurs last week that Lincoln Chafee could be running up the middle with the Libertarian Party.
If he was running up the middle with a football, it'd be fumbled. As always.
That's the last word. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in to Business Money Monday. But with Gary Sasse, it's all about money. Tomorrow, back here with Kate Nagel. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you tomorrow.